Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The mercury had been climbing for 6 straight days when Eleanor Brennan called our department at 2:17 in the morning, her voice shaking as she described voices coming from inside her farmhouse walls. I'm Sheriff Maria Santos of Dos Santos County, and in my 15 years wearing this badge, I've learned that extreme heat does things to people's minds that cold never could. The temperature hadn't dropped below 95 degrees even at night, and our small town of 847 souls was starting to crack under the pressure like dried mud in a riverbed. Eleanor Brennan lived alone on a sprawling ranch 12 miles outside town on Highway 83, the kind of isolated property where your nearest neighbor might as well be on the moon. Her late husband had built the house in 1967 with thick adobe walls designed to keep the heat out. But after 56 years, those same walls had developed a network of cracks and settling gaps that seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. When I arrived at her property, the porch thermometer read 108 degrees, and the cicadas were screaming so loud it felt like they were inside my skull. Eleanor met me at the door wearing a thin cotton nightgown soaked with perspiration, her gray hair plastered to her scalp with sweat. She'd been the town librarian for 30 years before retiring, a woman known for her sharp mind and steady demeanor, which made her current state all the more unsettling. Her hands trembled as she led me through the living room, past family photos that seemed to shimmer in the heat haze rising from the floorboards. The house felt like walking into an oven that had been left on for days. The voices started around midnight, she explained, pausing every few words to catch her breath in the stifling air. At first, she thought it might be the television left on in another room, but when she checked, every electronic device was turned off. The sounds seemed to move through the walls themselves, following the path of the old copper pipes that carried water from the well to the kitchen and bathroom. Sometimes the voices were just whispers, she said, but other times they spoke clearly enough that she could almost make out words. I spent 3 hours in that house, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding spot where an intruder might conceal themselves. The heat made every surface too hot to touch comfortably, and sweat poured off me like I was standing under a waterfall. But I found nothing except the normal sounds of an old house expanding and contracting in the extreme temperature. Wood beams creaking and metal fixtures pinging as they struggled against the thermal stress. The copper pipes did make odd noises when hot water ran through them, gurgling and tapping sounds that could conceivably be mistaken for voices if someone was already on edge. I left Eleanor with my card and a promise to increase patrols in her area, chalking the incident up to heat-induced stress and isolation. She'd been living alone since her husband died 2 years earlier, and the combination of extreme temperatures and rural solitude could play tricks on anyone's mind. But something about her certainty nagged at me as I drove back to town through the pre-dawn darkness, the road shimmering with heat, mirages even at 4 in the morning. The second call came 18 hours later, this time from Marcus Webb, a cattle rancher whose property bordered Eleanor's on the eastern side. Marcus was a practical man in his 50s who'd spent his entire life working outdoors in Texas heat, not someone prone to flights of imagination. But when I arrived at his house, I found him sitting on his front porch with a shotgun across his knees, staring at his own front door like it might suddenly sprout teeth and bite him. Marcus described the same phenomenon Eleanor had reported, voices coming from inside his walls, but with a crucial difference. While Eleanor's voices had been whispers and murmurs, Marcus claimed he could hear distinct conversations, multiple people talking about him as if they were discussing his daily routines and habits. They knew details about his life that strangers couldn't possibly know, he insisted. Things like the fact that he favored his right leg due to an old rodeo injury, or that he always checked the cattle in the south pasture first thing in the morning. The heat was making everyone irrational, I told myself as I searched Marcus's house, finding nothing but the same thermal stress sounds I'd encountered at Eleanor's place. Both houses were old, both used similar copper plumbing systems, and both residents were dealing with isolation and temperatures that pushed the human body to its limits. I was starting to see a pattern that had nothing to do with supernatural phenomena, and everything to do with the psychological effects of extreme weather on vulnerable populations. But the third call shattered my rational explanations completely. Catherine Morris lived in town, in a newer house with modern insulation and central air conditioning that actually worked. She was 42 years old, a nurse at the county hospital, and about as level-headed as they come. When she called at 11 p.m. on July 9th, describing voices in her walls that seemed to know intimate details about her patients and medical procedures, I realized we were dealing with something beyond heat-induced hallucinations. Catherine's house was blissfully cool when I arrived, a stark contrast to the furnace-like conditions I'd endured at the other two properties. But within minutes of entering her living room, I heard it myself. A soft, murmuring sound that seemed to emanate from the wall behind her television. The voices were indistinct but definitely human, and they seemed to pause whenever we moved closer to investigate. When I placed my ear against the wall, the sound stopped entirely, only to resume moments later from a different section of the room. I called in Deputy Rodriguez and Officer Chen, and together we began a systematic search of not just Catherine's house, but the entire neighborhood. What we discovered sent ice through my veins, despite the oppressive heat outside. Every house on Catherine's block was connected by an old drainage system that had been installed in the 1980s, a network of large concrete pipes running beneath the foundations to channel rainwater away from the residential area. The pipes were big enough for a person to crawl through, and they created an acoustic network that could carry voices from one house to another. But the drainage system couldn't explain how someone might know personal details about Eleanor's late husband's habits, or Marcus's injury, or Catherine's patients. For that level of intimate knowledge, our unknown voyeur would need to have been watching these people for months or even years, learning their routines and secrets before using the underground network to torment them. The realization that someone had been stalking multiple residents of our county while living literally underneath their homes was more terrifying than any supernatural explanation. The breakthrough came when we started mapping the drainage system against recent missing persons reports. 3 people had vanished from our county over the past 2 years, all of them transients or drifters who wouldn't be immediately missed. But their disappearances coincided with upgrades and repairs to the drainage system, work that would have given someone extended access to the underground tunnels without arousing suspicion. On July 12th, we organized a coordinated sweep of the entire drainage network, using thermal imaging equipment borrowed from the state police. What we found in a concealed chamber beneath the old Masonic Lodge downtown was a living space equipped with sleeping arrangements, canned food, and most disturbing of all, detailed surveillance notes on dozens of county residents. The handwriting was cramped and obsessive, documenting daily routines, family relationships, personal secrets, and vulnerabilities of people who had no idea they were being watched. The chamber also contained audio equipment sophisticated enough to tap into phone lines and electronic devices, explaining how our stalker had gained access to private conversations and confidential information. But most chilling were the plans sketched on makeshift blueprints, showing how the drainage system could be expanded to reach other neighborhoods, other potential victims. This wasn't a random predator, but someone with a long-term vision for expanding their underground surveillance network. We never found the person responsible. By the time we discovered their hidden chamber, they had abandoned it, leaving behind only the evidence of their obsessive surveillance and the knowledge that they were still out there somewhere, possibly establishing a new underground network in another unsuspecting community. The 3 missing persons were never located, though we found personal belongings and identification documents in the chamber that confirmed our worst fears about their fate. The heat wave finally broke on July 15th, bringing blessed relief to our county and an end to the reports of voices in the walls. But the psychological damage was permanent. Eleanor Brennan moved to live with her daughter in Austin, unable to remain in a house where she now knew someone had been listening to her most private moments. Marcus Webb installed a security system that rivals those used by federal facilities and still jumps at unexpected sounds. Catherine Morris transferred to a hospital in Dallas, citing the need for a fresh start. As for me, I learned that the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones that jump out of shadows or announce themselves with obvious threats. The truly dangerous predators are those who watch from hidden places, learning our habits and weaknesses while we go about our daily lives completely unaware that we're being studied like laboratory specimens. The heat had been unbearable that summer, but it was nothing compared to the cold knowledge that privacy is just an illusion, and safety is something we tell ourselves to sleep at night. The drainage system was sealed permanently after our investigation, filled with concrete and monitored by motion sensors. But on particularly quiet nights, when the wind blows just right through the spaces between buildings, I sometimes think I can still hear whispers in the walls, reminding me that there are always people watching from places we never think to look, and sometimes the most familiar voices are the ones we should fear the most. Sheriff Tom Bradley had been enjoying his retirement for exactly 7 months when the call came from his replacement, asking him to consult on a case that would drag him back into the world he'd tried to leave behind. The October wind was already carrying the bite of early winter through the valleys of Glacier County, Montana, where Bradley had spent 31 years as sheriff before hanging up his badge the previous March. He'd thought he was done with the darkness that seemed to seep out of the mountains every winter, done with the secrets that old families bury in places where the snow covers evidence for months at a time. The Whitmore family had owned the largest ranch in the county for 4 generations, a sprawling operation that covered nearly 12,000 acres of prime grazing land nestled between 2 mountain ranges. When old Ezra Whitmore died at age 89, his passing marked the end of an era and the beginning of a legal nightmare that would expose secrets buried deeper than any winter snow. The family, gathering for the reading of Ezra's will on October 15th, should have been a solemn affair, but instead it turned into something that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Bradley had known the Whitmore family for decades, had investigated domestic disputes at their ranch, dealt with their various legal troubles, and watched as each generation seemed to struggle with demons that went beyond normal family dysfunction. Ezra had been the patriarch, a man whose word was law throughout the county, but whose relationship with his children and grandchildren was marked by a coldness that went beyond typical frontier stoicism. The old man had ruled his family with the same iron fist he used to manage his cattle operation, and the results were visible in the haunted eyes of his descendants. The will reading took place in the library of the main ranch house, a massive log structure that Ezra's grandfather had built in 1897. The room was lined with hunting trophies and family photographs spanning over a century, creating an atmosphere of tradition and continuity that masked the poison flowing through the family's bloodline. Present were Ezra's 3 surviving children, Sarah, Michael, and David, along with 6 grandchildren and the family attorney, Harold Vance, who had served the Whitmores for over 20 years. What Vance read from the will that afternoon was not the standard distribution of property and assets that everyone expected. Instead, Ezra had left detailed instructions for locating and dealing with what he called the family's obligation, a responsibility that had been passed down through 4 generations but never fully explained to the younger family members. The will contained maps, coordinates, and cryptic references to maintaining the silence and feeding the mountain's hunger. Most disturbing were the instructions that the inheritance could only be claimed after the family fulfilled this mysterious obligation together. Sarah Whitmore, Ezra's eldest daughter and a respected veterinarian in the community, was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. She demanded that Vance explain what her father meant by these strange instructions, but the attorney claimed he knew only what was written in the will. The document specified that more detailed information was hidden in a location on the ranch that only the family could access together, using a combination of keys and knowledge that Ezra had distributed among his descendants over the years. The first key was hidden behind a loose stone in the library fireplace, exactly where the will indicated it would be. The second was buried beneath a marker in the family cemetery, a small plot on a hill overlooking the main house where 4 generations of Whitmores rested, under granite headstones worn smooth by mountain weather. But it was the location of the third key that created the first real moment of horror for the assembled family members. According to the will, the final key was located in what Ezra referred to as the feeding chamber, a place that his descendants would find in the abandoned mining claim on the northern edge of the property. The mining claim had been in the family since the 1890s, though no one alive remembered it ever producing anything valuable. Most of the family assumed it was just another piece of property that Ezra had maintained for sentimental reasons, but the will's references to it suggested something far more sinister. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke as the family made their way to the mining claim, driving through increasingly heavy snow in a convoy of trucks and SUVs. The wind howled through the mountain passes with a violence that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. And Bradley couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading toward something that should have remained buried forever. The mining claim was marked only by a few weathered posts and a rusted sign that was barely readable after decades of mountain weather. What they found, hidden beneath an overgrown section of the claim, was not an abandoned mine shaft but a concrete structure built into the hillside, disguised so well that it was virtually invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The entrance was sealed with a heavy metal door secured by 3 different locks, each requiring one of the keys mentioned in Ezra's will. When the last lock clicked open and the door swung inward with a groan of protesting hinges, the smell that emerged made several family members immediately step back and cover their faces. The chamber beyond the door was not a natural cave or mining tunnel but a purpose-built room with concrete walls and a drainage system designed to channel away fluids. The space was roughly 20 feet square, with a high ceiling disappearing into darkness above. Along one wall were shelves containing various tools and equipment, while the center of the room featured a large metal table surrounded by what appeared to be restraint devices. But most horrifying were the journals stacked neatly on a desk in the corner, documenting activities that spanned 4 generations of Whitmore family history. The journals, written in multiple hands across different time periods, detailed a family tradition that went far beyond anything the current generation had imagined. Beginning with Ezra's grandfather in the 1890s, each generation of Whitmores had used their isolated ranch and respected position in the community to prey upon travelers, drifters, and anyone else who wouldn't be immediately missed. The mining claim had provided the perfect cover for disposal of evidence, while the family's wealth and influence had protected them from serious investigation. Michael Whitmore, Ezra's middle son and the family member most involved in ranch operations, was the first to speak after the initial shock wore off. He claimed he had suspected something was wrong with the family for years, pointing to unexplained disappearances of ranch workers. His father's insistence on handling certain business matters personally, and the way older family members had always seemed to share secrets that were never discussed openly. But even his suspicions hadn't prepared him for the scope of what they were discovering. The journals revealed that each generation had contributed to what they called the harvest, with careful records kept of victims, methods, and disposal techniques refined over decades of practice. The current chamber was actually the third such facility the family had maintained, with earlier versions having been abandoned and sealed when they became too risky to continue using. The most recent entries, written in Ezra's distinctive handwriting, dated from just 6 months before his death, suggesting that the family's dark tradition had continued right up until the patriarch's final illness. David Whitmore, the youngest of Ezra's children, and the one who had always seemed most distant from family affairs, made a discovery that sent new waves of horror through the group. In a locked cabinet hidden behind false panels, he found photographs and personal belongings from dozens of victims spanning decades. Driver's licenses showed faces of people who had simply vanished from the world, their disappearances never solved because investigators had no reason to connect them to the respected Whitmore family. What made the discovery even more disturbing was the realization that several family members had always known about the tradition, but had convinced themselves it was something from the past, not an ongoing activity. Sarah admitted that her father had made cryptic comments over the years about family responsibilities and maintaining traditions, but she had assumed he was talking about normal ranch operations and community leadership. The shock of learning the truth was compounded by the guilt of having been willfully blind to signs that, in retrospect, should have been impossible to ignore. The weather outside had deteriorated to the point where travel was becoming dangerous, trapping the family at the mining claim while they grappled with the horrifying legacy they had inherited. The storm seemed to mirror the chaos in their minds as they tried to process the reality that their respected family name was built on generations of murder and disappearance. Some argued for immediately contacting law enforcement, while others worried about the destruction that exposure would bring to the surviving family members, including young grandchildren who bore no responsibility for their ancestors' crimes. As the night wore on and the storm intensified, the family made an even more disturbing discovery. Hidden beneath the main chamber was a second level, accessed by a narrow staircase carved into the rock. This lower level contained evidence that the Whitmore family tradition was not unique, but part of a larger network of similar operations scattered throughout the mountain region. Maps on the walls showed locations of other properties, other families, other harvest sites stretching across 3 states. The network appeared to operate like a loose confederation, with different families specializing in different aspects of what could only be described as an industrial-scale killing operation. Some focused on procurement, others on disposal, while still others provided logistical support and protection from law enforcement. The Whitmore's role seemed to be processing and disposal, taking advantage of their remote location and mining claims to eliminate evidence of activities that originated elsewhere. Communication between network members was maintained through coded messages in local newspapers, specific arrangements of items at predetermined locations, and occasional meetings disguised as normal, business or social interactions. The system had operated for over a century with minimal detection because it was designed to appear as nothing more than the normal activities of established, respected families. Law enforcement agencies investigating individual disappearances had no way to recognize the larger pattern because each family's crimes appeared isolated and unconnected. The journals also revealed that Ezra had grown increasingly paranoid in his final years, believing that law enforcement agencies were beginning to notice patterns that could expose the entire network. His decision to document everything in his will was apparently intended as an insurance policy, ensuring that if he died unexpectedly, his family could take appropriate measures to protect themselves and continue the tradition. But his death from natural causes had come before he could properly prepare his descendants for the reality of their inheritance. As dawn broke and the storm finally began to subside, the family faced an impossible choice. They could contact law enforcement and expose not only their own family's crimes, but potentially an entire network of similar operations, destroying dozens of families and communities in the process. Or they could find a way to quietly shut down their part of the operation while protecting their family name and the innocent members who had known nothing about the tradition. The decision was made when Sarah's teenage daughter, Emma, who had been exploring the lower chamber, discovered something that changed everything. Hidden in a sealed container was recent correspondence between Ezra and other network members, including plans for expanding operations and bringing the younger generation of various families into active participation. The network was not winding down, but preparing for a new phase of activity, with Emma and her cousins already identified as future participants. The family's decision to contact law enforcement was immediate and unanimous. Whatever consequences they faced for their ancestors' crimes, they could not allow the tradition to continue into another generation. The call to Sheriff Bradley's replacement came as rescue crews were working to clear the mountain roads, and within hours the isolated mining claim was swarming with state and federal investigators who would spend months processing evidence from one of the most extensive crime scenes in Montana history. The investigation that followed would ultimately expose a network of family-based killing operations spanning 11 states and involving over 40 families. The Whitmore evidence provided the breakthrough that law enforcement agencies had needed to connect disappearances that had been investigated separately for decades. Hundreds of missing persons cases were finally solved, though the knowledge brought little comfort to families who had spent years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. For Sheriff Bradley, the case represented a bitter end to his career in law enforcement. The realization that such an extensive criminal network had operated in his jurisdiction for decades without detection was a failure that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Whitmore family's cooperation had been essential to exposing the larger conspiracy, but it could not undo the decades of suffering their ancestors had caused or the communities that were shattered when the truth finally emerged. The Whitmore Ranch was eventually sold to the federal government and converted into a memorial for the victims whose remains were recovered from various sites across the property. The family members who had discovered their dark legacy scattered across the country, changing their names and trying to build new lives far from the mountain valleys where their ancestors had written such a horrifying chapter of American crime. But on quiet winter nights, when the wind howls through the mountain passes the way it did on that October evening when the truth finally emerged, local residents sometimes report hearing sounds from the abandoned mining claims. Voices carried on the wind that remind them of the darkness that can hide beneath the most respectable facades and the secrets that families will kill to protect. Sheriff Kate Morrison had been wearing the badge for exactly 26 months when the first body turned up along the Appalachian Trail in the remote northern section of Rabun County, Georgia. The discovery came on February 8th during one of the harshest winters the region had seen in decades, with snow depths reaching levels that made travel dangerous and searches nearly impossible. Morrison was young for a sheriff at 32, having won a special election after her predecessor retired suddenly due to health issues, but her background in forensic science and experience with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation had convinced voters she could handle the job. The victim was identified as Marcus Chen, a 34-year-old software engineer from Atlanta who had been reported missing by his girlfriend 3 weeks earlier after failing to return from a solo hiking trip. Chen was an experienced backpacker who knew the mountain trails well, making his disappearance particularly puzzling, since he had planned only a 2-day excursion on a section of trail he had hiked multiple times before. When his body was discovered by cross-country skiers who had ventured off the marked trail system, the cause of death immediately raised red flags that transformed a missing person case into a homicide investigation. The medical examiner's preliminary report indicated that Chen had died from a combination of exposure and what appeared to be intentional restraint in freezing conditions. His hands and feet showed ligature marks consistent with rope or cable ties, and his body position suggested he had been secured to a tree and left to die slowly as temperatures dropped below zero. Most disturbing was evidence that Chen had been alive for several hours after being restrained, with the tissue damage indicating desperate attempts to free himself from his bonds. Morrison called in the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and established a joint task force to investigate what was clearly a premeditated murder committed in one of the most remote areas of their jurisdiction. The location where Chen's body was found was accessible only by hiking nearly 8 miles from the nearest road, requiring intimate knowledge of trail systems and mountain geography that suggested either a local perpetrator or someone with extensive experience in wilderness areas. The investigation was complicated by weather conditions that had destroyed most potential evidence at the crime scene. 3 major snowstorms had hit the area since Chen's disappearance, bearing footprints, tire tracks, and any other physical evidence that might have pointed investigators toward a suspect. The extreme cold had also accelerated decomposition in ways that made determining exact time of death difficult, though the medical examiner estimated Chen had been killed within 48 hours of his last confirmed sighting at a trail supply store in Clayton. 2 weeks into the investigation, Morrison received a call from the sheriff's department in neighboring Habersham County reporting a similar case. James Rodriguez, a 29-year-old teacher from Gainesville, had been found under circumstances nearly identical to Chen's death. Rodriguez had also been an experienced hiker who had disappeared while on a solo trip, and his body showed the same evidence of restraint and intentional exposure to fatal conditions. The location was different, but still within the vast network of trails and wilderness areas that crisscrossed the North Georgia mountains. The connection between the cases was strengthened when forensic analysis revealed that both victims had been restrained using the same type of military-grade zip ties, purchased in bulk from suppliers that typically served law enforcement and security contractors. The killer was using professional restraint equipment and demonstrated knowledge of how to secure victims in ways that would ensure slow death from exposure while minimizing the chances of escape or rescue. Morrison expanded the investigation to include a review of all missing persons and unsolved deaths in the region over the previous 5 years, looking for additional cases that might fit the emerging pattern. What she discovered was a cluster of disappearances that had been investigated separately by different agencies, each assuming they were dealing with isolated incidents of hikers who had gotten lost or injured in dangerous terrain. The pattern that emerged was chilling in its consistency. Over the previous 4 years, 9 experienced hikers had vanished while on solo trips in the North Georgia mountains. 7 of the bodies had eventually been found, all showing evidence of restraint and intentional exposure, while 2 remained missing despite extensive search efforts. The victims were all male, aged 25 to 40, physically fit, and familiar with mountain hiking. They had disappeared during different seasons and from different trailheads, but all within a roughly 50-mile radius of the Appalachian Trail corridor. The killer's method was becoming clear through forensic analysis and crime scene reconstruction. Victims were being approached on remote sections of trail, possibly by someone posing as a fellow hiker or offering assistance. Once isolated, they were restrained and transported to carefully selected locations where they would be secured to trees or rocks and left to die from exposure. The killer was selecting sites that were difficult to reach and unlikely to be discovered quickly, giving weather and wildlife time to destroy evidence before bodies were found. What made the investigation particularly challenging was the vast area involved and the seasonal nature of trail use. During winter months, most sections of the Appalachian Trail system were used only by the most dedicated hikers, creating perfect conditions for a predator who could move through the mountains without being observed. The killer appeared to have intimate knowledge of trail patterns, seasonal usage, and the timing of ranger patrols that might interfere with his activities. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Williams, a wildlife researcher studying black bear populations in the region, had been using motion-activated trail cameras to monitor animal behavior throughout the mountain corridor. While reviewing footage from the previous 2 years, she discovered images that showed a figure moving through remote areas during time periods that corresponded with several of the disappearances. The trail camera footage was grainy and often obscured by vegetation, but it showed someone carrying equipment that appeared to include the type of restraint devices used in the murders. More importantly, the cameras had captured images of the same individual at different locations separated by many miles, suggesting someone with both the physical capability and geographical knowledge necessary to move quickly through difficult terrain. Analysis of the camera footage revealed that the suspect was using a network of old logging roads and abandoned mining trails to access remote sections of the hiking trails without being detected by normal surveillance or casual observation. These backcountry routes were known primarily to locals with long family histories in the region, or to someone who had spent considerable time studying historical maps and exploring areas that most hikers never ventured into. Morrison worked with geographic profiling experts to map the pattern of crimes against the trail camera locations and known access routes. The analysis suggested that the killer was operating from a base location somewhere in the central part of the search area, probably a residence or cabin that provided easy access to multiple trail systems while remaining isolated from neighbors who might notice unusual activity. The profile, developed by FBI behavioral analysts, described someone with military or law enforcement training, comfortable operating alone in wilderness conditions for extended periods, and possessing both the physical strength and psychological detachment necessary to carry out prolonged torture scenarios. The use of professional restraint equipment and the methodical approach to victim selection suggested someone familiar with investigative procedures who was consciously working to avoid detection. On March 15th, Morrison received a call from a local resident who had seen the trail camera images published in regional newspapers. Thomas Brennan, a retired Forest Service employee, recognized the figure in one of the photographs as someone he had encountered multiple times over the past few years in remote areas of the national forest. The individual had always claimed to be conducting wildlife research or survey work, but Brennan had noticed that his equipment didn't match his stated purpose, and his knowledge of local geography was unusually extensive for an outsider. Brennan's description led investigators to David Kellerman, a 47-year-old former military police officer who had purchased an isolated cabin in the mountains 3 years earlier. Kellerman had no local criminal record and had been living quietly in the community, occasionally taking seasonal work with hunting outfitters and trail maintenance crews. His military background included specialized training in survival skills and prisoner restraint techniques that matched the methods used in the murders. Surveillance of Kellerman's property revealed a pattern of activity that corresponded with the timeline of disappearances. He would disappear from his cabin for periods of several days at a time, returning with equipment that he stored in a locked outbuilding on his property. More significantly, his vehicle showed signs of heavy use on rough terrain, and soil samples from his truck bed matched geological markers from several of the crime scenes. The search warrant executed on Kellerman's property yielded evidence that confirmed him as the serial killer who had been terrorizing hikers throughout the region. The outbuilding contained restraint devices identical to those used in the murders, detailed topographical maps with victim locations marked, and most damning of all, personal items taken from each of the victims as trophies. Kellerman's cabin also contained journals documenting his activities over the previous 4 years, written in a clinical style that described his murders as hunting expeditions. He viewed experienced hikers as challenging prey that required skill and planning to capture successfully. The journals revealed that he had been studying potential victims for weeks or months before making contact, learning their hiking patterns and preferred routes before striking when conditions were optimal. During interrogation, Kellerman showed no remorse for his actions, describing the murders as a logical extension of his military training and his philosophy that weak individuals deserved to be eliminated by stronger predators. He had chosen the hiking community as his hunting ground because it provided access to physically fit victims who would provide what he called appropriate challenge, while the remote locations allowed him to enjoy the process of killing without time pressure or fear of interruption. The investigation revealed that Kellerman had been planning to expand his activities to other regions, with maps and research materials indicating he had been studying trail systems in North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. His arrest prevented what could have become a regional epidemic of hiking-related murders, as he perfected his techniques and grew more confident in his ability to avoid detection. For Sheriff Morrison, the case represented both a triumph and a sobering introduction to the depths of human evil that could hide in her jurisdiction. The successful conclusion of the investigation established her reputation as a competent law enforcement officer, but the knowledge of how long Kellerman had operated without detection raised troubling questions about the safety of wilderness areas that attracted thousands of visitors each year. The case led to significant changes in how missing persons investigations are conducted in wilderness areas, with improved coordination between agencies and enhanced surveillance of remote trail access points. Trail camera networks were expanded and integrated into a regional monitoring system designed to detect unusual activity in areas frequented by solo hikers and backpackers. Kellerman was convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death, though appeals are expected to continue for years. During his trial, he expressed disappointment that his activities had been discovered before he could complete what he called his research into human survival limits under extreme stress. He maintained that his victims had been given opportunities to escape and that their deaths proved they were unworthy of survival. The families of Kellerman's victims established a foundation dedicated to improving safety education for wilderness hikers and supporting search and rescue operations in remote areas. Memorial markers were placed along several sections of the Appalachian Trail where victims were found, serving as reminders that even in places of natural beauty, human predators can transform peaceful recreation into deadly encounters. Sheriff Morrison continues to serve Robin County, but the case fundamentally changed her approach to wilderness law enforcement. She now views the vast mountain areas of her jurisdiction not just as recreational resources, but as potential hunting grounds for predators who understand that isolation can be their greatest weapon, and that the beauty of wild places can conceal the darkest human intentions. The call came in during the heaviest spring rain Sheriff Robert Hayes had seen in his 18 years of law enforcement in Crawford County, Ohio, where endless acres of corn and soybean fields stretched between small farming communities that had been losing population for decades. The rain had been falling for 6 straight days, turning dirt roads into muddy quagmires and flooding low-lying areas throughout the county. It was the kind of weather that kept most people indoors, which made the discovery of a young woman walking barefoot along State Route 47 at 3 a.m. particularly troubling. Deputy Sarah Chen had spotted the woman during a routine patrol, stumbling through the downpour wearing only a thin dress that was completely inadequate for the 40-degree weather. When Chen approached, she found a Hispanic female, approximately 18 to 20 years old, who spoke no English and appeared to be in a state of severe psychological distress. The woman kept repeating a single phrase in Spanish that Chen didn't recognize, while pointing frantically toward the rural areas north of the highway. Hayes arrived at the scene 20 minutes later, bringing along Maria Santos, a bilingual social worker who often assisted the department with translation services. What Santos learned from the frightened young woman would launch an investigation that would ultimately expose a human trafficking operation stretching across 6 states and involving dozens of victims who'd simply vanished from urban areas hundreds of miles away. The woman, who identified herself only as Carmen, claimed to have escaped from a building where she and others were being held against their will. Her description of the location was vague and confused, but she insisted that many other people were still trapped there, including children. Most disturbing was her account of being transported to Ohio from El Paso, Texas, in the back of a produce truck along with dozens of other people who had been promised work opportunities, but instead found themselves imprisoned in what she described as a prison disguised as a farm operation. Carmen's physical condition supported her claims of prolonged captivity and abuse. Medical examination revealed evidence of malnutrition, untreated injuries, and what appeared to be restraint marks on her wrists and ankles. Her feet were badly cut from running barefoot through rough terrain, and her psychological state suggested someone who had endured extended trauma. Most significantly, she had a small tattoo on her shoulder that medical personnel recognized as a marking used by trafficking organizations to identify their victims. Hayes immediately contacted the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation and the FBI, recognizing that Carmen's account described a criminal operation far beyond the capabilities of his rural sheriff's department to handle alone. Within hours, federal agents were interviewing Carmen through professional interpreters, while Hayes coordinated with his deputies to begin searching for the facility she had described. The challenge was that Carmen's directions were limited to landmarks she could remember from her escape route, and her trauma made it difficult to provide coherent geographical references. The search focused on agricultural properties in the northern part of the county, areas where large buildings and transient workers would not attract unusual attention from neighbors. Hayes had lived in Crawford County his entire life, and knew that many of the old dairy operations and grain storage facilities had been abandoned or converted to other uses as farming economics changed. These properties provided perfect cover for illegal operations that needed to remain hidden from both law enforcement and the general public. Carmen's description of the facility included details that helped narrow the search parameters. She mentioned a large metal building with no windows, surrounded by high fencing and accessed by a gravel road that passed through 2 gates. More specifically, she remembered that the building was located near a distinctive red barn with a cupola and weather vane, and that the sound of highway traffic was audible from the location where she had been held. On the second day of the search, Deputy Mike Rodriguez discovered a property that matched Carmen's description. The abandoned Brennan Dairy Farm had been sold 3 years earlier to a company called Midwest Agricultural Services, which claimed to use the facilities for grain storage and equipment maintenance. The property included a large metal building that had been added after the sale, along with security fencing that seemed excessive for a legitimate agricultural operation. Surveillance of the property revealed patterns of activity that were inconsistent with normal farming operations. Vehicles arrived and departed at unusual hours, including produce trucks and vans with out-of-state license plates. Most concerning was the observation that people who entered the main building were rarely seen leaving, and those who did emerge appeared to be different individuals than those who had gone in. The property also showed signs of recent construction and modification that would have required significant investment for a rural storage facility. Hayes coordinated with federal agencies to obtain surveillance equipment that could monitor the property without alerting its occupants to law enforcement interest. What they discovered over the following week was a sophisticated operation that used legitimate agricultural businesses as cover for a human trafficking pipeline that transported victims from border states to urban markets throughout the Midwest. The trafficking network operated by using produce transportation as cover for moving people across state lines. Victims were hidden in specially modified trucks that appeared to be carrying normal agricultural cargo, but actually contained concealed compartments where people could be transported in conditions that barely sustained life. The rural Ohio facility served as a processing center where victims were held temporarily, while arrangements were made for their final destinations in cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland. Federal wiretaps revealed that the operation was controlled by a criminal organization with connections to trafficking networks in Mexico and Central America. Victims were recruited in border cities with promises of legitimate employment opportunities, but instead found themselves trapped in a system of forced labor and sexual exploitation. The rural location in Ohio was chosen specifically because it allowed the organization to operate without the scrutiny that urban facilities would attract. The breakthrough in the investigation came when agents intercepted communications indicating that a large shipment of victims was scheduled to arrive at the facility within 48 hours. Hayes worked with federal tactical teams to plan a coordinated raid that would rescue the victims while capturing as many members of the trafficking organization as possible. The operation required careful timing to avoid alerting the criminals while ensuring the safety of potentially dozens of imprisoned people. The raid on the Brennan farm property revealed conditions that shocked even experienced federal agents who had investigated trafficking operations throughout the country. The metal building had been converted into a makeshift prison with dozens of small cells constructed from chain-link fencing and plywood. The facility held 43 people ranging in age from 14 to 35, including men, women, and children who had been transported from Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico over the previous 6 months. Victims described a systematic operation that controlled every aspect of their lives through violence, intimidation, and the threat of harm to family members who remained in their home countries. They were forced to work in various illegal operations throughout the region, including drug processing, agricultural labor, and prostitution, with all earnings confiscated by their captors. Medical examination revealed evidence of severe abuse and neglect that had been deliberately used to maintain control over the imprisoned population. The facility also contained evidence of the broader trafficking network, including detailed records of victim transportation, financial transactions, and communications with similar operations in other states. Computer files revealed that the Ohio facility was just one component of a regional network that processed hundreds of trafficking victims annually, generating millions of dollars in illegal profits for the criminal organization. Among the evidence recovered was documentation showing that several law enforcement officials and local government employees had been receiving payments in exchange for ignoring suspicious activity or providing advance warning of potential investigations. The corruption network extended to county officials who had approved construction permits without proper inspection, and state employees who had processed vehicle registrations and business licenses without conducting required background checks. Hayes discovered that one of his own deputies, Tom Walsh, had been providing information to the trafficking organization about law enforcement activities in the county. Walsh had been receiving monthly payments in exchange for reporting on investigations, patrol schedules, and any signs that federal agencies might be taking interest in local activities. The betrayal was particularly devastating because Walsh had been one of Hayes's most trusted officers and had participated in the early stages of the investigation into Carmen's escape. The arrests that followed the raid included 12 individuals directly involved in operating the trafficking facility, plus 7 others charged with providing support services, including transportation, document fraud, and money laundering. The investigation ultimately expanded to include operations in Indiana, Michigan, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky, resulting in over 60 arrests and the rescue of more than 200 trafficking victims. For the victims rescued from the Ohio facility, recovery would be a long and difficult process. Many had been trafficked for months or years and required extensive medical treatment and psychological counseling. The federal government provided resources for victim assistance, but the trauma of their experiences would affect many of them for the rest of their lives. Several victims chose to remain in the United States to testify against their captors, while others requested repatriation to their home countries. Carmen, the young woman whose escape had exposed the entire operation, became a key witness in the federal prosecution of the trafficking organization. Her courage in fleeing the facility and cooperating with law enforcement despite the danger to herself and her family made possible the rescue of dozens of other victims and the disruption of a major criminal network. She was granted special immigration status and eventually settled in Ohio, where she works with organizations dedicated to helping other trafficking survivors. The investigation revealed that rural areas throughout the United States are increasingly being used as staging areas for human trafficking operations because they offer isolation from law enforcement scrutiny while providing access to transportation networks that connect urban markets. The case led to enhanced training for rural law enforcement agencies on recognizing signs of trafficking activity and improved coordination between local, state, and federal agencies in investigating these complex criminal enterprises. For Sheriff Hayes, the case fundamentally changed his understanding of crime in rural America. The realization that his county had been used as a hub for one of the most serious human rights violations occurring within United States borders was both shocking and motivating. He implemented new training protocols for his department and established partnerships with federal agencies to monitor ongoing trafficking threats in agricultural areas. The Brennan farm property was seized by the federal government and eventually demolished, with the land converted into a memorial park dedicated to victims of human trafficking. The memorial includes information about recognizing signs of trafficking activity and resources for reporting suspected cases to appropriate authorities. Local schools now include human trafficking awareness in their safety education programs, teaching students to recognize and report suspicious activities that might indicate trafficking operations in their communities. The prosecution of the trafficking organization resulted in sentences ranging from 20 to 50 years in federal prison for the primary defendants. Several plea agreements led to additional investigations that exposed related trafficking networks throughout the Midwest. The case became a model for how rural law enforcement agencies can work with federal partners to combat trafficking operations that use agricultural areas as cover for their criminal activities. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the case was the recognition that human trafficking is not just an urban problem or an international issue, but a crime that can operate in any community where criminals believe they can escape detection. The rural highways and farmlands of America provide perfect cover for moving victims and operating facilities, making local law enforcement agencies crucial partners in the fight against modern slavery. Hayes continues to serve as sheriff of Crawford County, but now views every abandoned building and every unusual agricultural operation as a potential site for criminal activity. The endless fields of corn and soybeans that once represented the peaceful character of his county now remind him that predators will always seek isolated places to conduct their business, and that vigilance is the price of protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit them. Sheriff Lisa Martinez had been tracking the unusual activity at the Desert Springs compound for 6 months before she finally had enough evidence to justify a search warrant. But even then, she wasn't prepared for what her deputies would discover in the remote Nevada desert where the cult calling itself the Family of the Eternal Dawn had established their isolated community. The compound sat on 400 acres of scrubland 40 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a single dirt road that wound through rocky canyons and Joshua tree forests that provided perfect cover for activities that the outside world was never meant to witness. The investigation had begun when Janet Morrison, a former compound resident, walked into Martinez's office in late January, claiming that her 16-year-old daughter, Sarah, was being held against her will by the cult's leadership. Morrison had lived at Desert Springs for 3 years after her husband's death left her desperate for community and meaning. But she had fled the compound alone when she became convinced that the group's charismatic leader, a man calling himself Prophet David, was planning to use her daughter in what he described as a sacred marriage ceremony. Morrison's account of life inside the compound described a closed society where normal rules of law and behavior had been replaced by the absolute authority of Prophet David, whose real name was Thomas Kellerman, a former insurance salesman from Ohio who had established the group 5 years earlier after claiming to receive divine revelations in the Nevada desert. Under Kellerman's leadership, the family of the Eternal Dawn had grown to include nearly 200 members who had surrendered their possessions, severed ties with outside family, and submitted to a lifestyle of communal living and unquestioning obedience. Martinez faced the challenge of investigating a group that operated entirely on private property in one of the most isolated regions of her jurisdiction, where normal surveillance techniques were nearly impossible, and where any approach by law enforcement would be immediately detected by compound security. The cult members were known to be armed and had made statements about defending their religious freedom against government interference, creating the potential for a dangerous confrontation if the investigation was not handled carefully. The breakthrough came when Martinez received a call from Dr. Rebecca Stone, a psychologist in Las Vegas who had been treating several former cult members who had managed to escape from the compound over the previous 2 years. Dr. Stone reported a pattern of psychological abuse and manipulation that suggested the group was using sophisticated techniques to control members' behavior and prevent them from leaving. More concerning were accounts of punishment rituals and medical neglect that might constitute criminal abuse of vulnerable adults and children. Working with federal agencies that had experience investigating religious extremist groups, Martinez began building a case that focused on specific criminal activities rather than the group's religious beliefs. Former members provided detailed accounts of financial fraud, child abuse, and illegal weapons possession that gave law enforcement legitimate reasons to seek access to the compound. Most importantly, they described a hierarchy of control that kept most members isolated from outside information while concentrating absolute power in Kellerman and his inner circle of trusted lieutenants. The psychological manipulation described by former members was particularly sophisticated, using techniques that had been refined over years of practice to break down individual resistance and create total dependence on the group for identity and purpose. New members were subjected to sleep deprivation, dietary restrictions, and constant group pressure that made critical thinking nearly impossible. Children born in the compound were educated only in approved subjects and had no contact with outside perspectives that might challenge the group's worldview. Dr. Stone's psychological evaluations of former members revealed symptoms consistent with prolonged psychological abuse, including learned helplessness, difficulty making independent decisions, and intense fear of punishment or abandonment. Several former members required months of therapy to regain the ability to function independently in normal society. Most disturbing were accounts from former members who described witnessing other residents suffer complete psychological breakdowns when they attempted to question the group's teachings or express doubts about Kellerman's authority. The compound's physical layout, as described by former residents, was designed to facilitate control and surveillance of the membership. Living quarters were arranged to make privacy impossible, with members sleeping in dormitory-style buildings where conversation could be monitored by designated informants. Work schedules were designed to keep members busy and exhausted, while communal meals and meetings provided opportunities for continuous indoctrination and identification of potential dissidents. Medical care within the compound was controlled by Kellerman and his inner circle, with serious health problems being treated through prayer and herbal remedies rather than conventional medicine. Former members reported deaths that should have been preventable with proper medical intervention, but the bodies were buried in a private cemetery on compound property without death certificates or outside medical examination. Children showing signs of serious illness were often isolated from their parents and treated only by approved cult members who lacked medical training. Financial control was maintained through a system that required all members to surrender their assets upon joining, with earnings from compound businesses being controlled entirely by the leadership. Members worked in various enterprises, including construction, agriculture, and crafts production, but received only basic subsistence in return for their labor. The significant profits generated by these businesses were used to purchase weapons, expand compound facilities, and support Kellerman's increasingly extravagant lifestyle. The evidence that finally justified a search warrant came from a former compound member named Michael Torres, who had managed to escape with photographs and documents that proved the group was engaging in systematic child abuse and financial fraud. Torres had worked in the compound's administrative office and had copied records showing that Kellerman was using member labor to generate profits that were hidden from tax authorities, while children as young as 12 were being forced to work in dangerous conditions without education or medical care. The raid on the Desert Springs compound was planned as a joint operation involving the Sheriff's Department, Nevada State Police, FBI agents, and Child Protective Services workers. The approach required careful coordination to avoid the kind of violent confrontation that had characterized previous law enforcement actions against extremist religious groups. Martinez insisted on using negotiation and gradual pressure rather than aggressive tactics that might trigger a defensive response from armed cult members. The operation began before dawn on a Tuesday morning in late July, with law enforcement teams positioned at strategic points around the compound perimeter, while negotiators used loudspeakers to communicate with the residents. The initial response from compound leadership was predictably hostile, with Kellerman claiming that the government had no authority over his religious community and threatening to defend their sacred ground against what he called persecution by Satan's agents. What law enforcement discovered during the subsequent standoff was a level of psychological control that exceeded even the most pessimistic predictions based on former member accounts. Many compound residents appeared genuinely terrified of the outside world and begged not to be removed from what they considered their salvation from a corrupt society. Children who had never lived outside the compound showed signs of severe psychological conditioning that made them view law enforcement officers as literal demons sent to destroy their souls. The compound's facilities revealed the infrastructure of a sophisticated control system designed to monitor and manipulate every aspect of members' lives. Dormitory buildings were equipped with hidden microphones and cameras that allowed leadership to monitor private conversations and identify potential troublemakers. The compound's medical facility was stocked with psychoactive drugs that former members reported being used to sedate dissidents and maintain compliance among the general population. Most disturbing was the discovery of punishment facilities that had been used to discipline members who questioned the group's teachings or violated its rules. These included isolation cells where members could be confined for weeks at a time, sensory deprivation chambers used for what Kellerman called spiritual purification, and restraint devices that had been used to prevent escape attempts by members trying to leave the compound. The compound cemetery contained the bodies of at least 15 former members who had died under suspicious circumstances over the previous 5 years, including several children who appeared to have died from treatable medical conditions. Many of the graves were unmarked, and the bodies had been buried without proper death certificates or medical examination, making it impossible to determine exact causes of death without extensive forensic investigation. Kellerman's living quarters stood in stark contrast to the Spartan conditions endured by regular members, featuring luxury furnishings, gourmet food, and personal amenities that had been purchased with profits from member labor. His private office contained detailed psychological profiles of each compound resident, including information about their vulnerabilities, fears, and personal histories that could be used to maintain control over their behavior. The rescue operation ultimately freed 163 compound residents, including 47 children who had been born in the cult and had never received conventional education or medical care. Many adult members initially resisted being removed from what they considered their home, but psychological evaluation revealed that their resistance was the result of systematic conditioning rather than genuine free choice. Kellerman and 12 of his inner circle members were arrested on charges including kidnapping, child abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit various felonies. During interrogation, Kellerman showed no remorse for his actions and continued to insist that he was a divine messenger whose authority superseded human law. He claimed that his followers had joined his community voluntarily and that any suffering they endured was necessary for their spiritual development. The psychological evaluation of Kellerman revealed a narcissistic personality disorder combined with sociopathic tendencies that allowed him to manipulate others without experiencing empathy or guilt. He had developed his control techniques through years of studying psychology and religious history, combining elements from various cult movements to create a system of domination that was particularly effective against vulnerable individuals seeking meaning and community. The prosecution of the Desert Springs cult case resulted in convictions for all of the leadership members, with Kellerman receiving a life sentence without possibility of parole. The compound property was seized by the federal government and eventually demolished, with the land being converted to a memorial park dedicated to victims of cult abuse and psychological manipulation. For the rescued cult members, recovery was a lengthy and difficult process that required extensive psychological counseling and practical assistance with reintegrating into normal society. Many had lost contact with outside family members and had no resources or skills that would allow them to live independently. Federal and state agencies provided specialized programs to help former cult members rebuild their lives, but the psychological damage from years of manipulation would affect many of them permanently. The children rescued from the compound faced particular challenges, having been raised in an environment that provided no preparation for life in normal society. Many required intensive education to reach grade-appropriate levels in basic subjects, while others struggled with psychological trauma that manifested in various behavioral and emotional problems. Foster care and adoption services worked to place the children with families capable of addressing their unique needs. For Sheriff Martinez, the Desert Springs case demonstrated how religious freedom could be manipulated to conceal serious criminal activity in isolated areas where law enforcement oversight was minimal. The investigation led to enhanced training for rural law enforcement agencies on recognizing signs of cult activity and improved coordination with federal agencies that had experience investigating extremist religious groups. The case also highlighted the need for better protection of vulnerable adults who might be targeted by manipulative groups seeking to exploit their psychological needs and financial resources. New legislation was introduced to strengthen laws against psychological abuse and to provide better support services for victims of cult manipulation and other forms of systematic psychological control. Martinez continues to serve as sheriff of her county, but now pays special attention to isolated religious or communal groups that might be operating beyond normal social oversight. The vast expanses of Nevada desert that once seemed empty and harmless now remind her that isolation can provide perfect cover for predators who understand that physical distance from civilization can enable the most serious violations of human dignity and freedom. Sheriff Mike Thompson had handled his share of drug-related incidents during his 25 years in law enforcement in Madison County, Arkansas, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the events that began unfolding on the morning of April 23rd, when his department received 17 separate emergency calls within the span of 2 hours, all reporting the same impossible phenomenon. Citizens throughout the rural county were calling to report that their neighbors, family members, and co-workers had suddenly begun exhibiting violent and irrational behavior, claiming to see things that weren't there and attacking people they had known for years without provocation or explanation. The first call came from Martha Henderson, a retired schoolteacher who lived alone on a farm outside the town of Huntsville. Henderson reported that her neighbor, a quiet man named Robert Chen, who had helped with her farm chores for years, had appeared at her door that morning screaming about invisible attackers and begging her to help him hide from people who were trying to kill him. When Henderson tried to calm him down, Chen had become violent and had to be physically restrained until deputies could arrive to take him into custody. Within 30 minutes of Henderson's call, similar reports were flooding the dispatch center from locations scattered throughout the county. People who had been functioning normally the day before were suddenly experiencing what appeared to be severe psychotic episodes, characterized by vivid hallucinations, paranoid delusions, and aggressive behavior that posed a danger to themselves and others. Most disturbing was the consistent nature of the hallucinations being reported, with affected individuals claiming to see shadowy figures following them, and voices instructing them to defend themselves against imaginary threats. Thompson immediately suspected that the county was dealing with some form of mass poisoning, possibly from contaminated water supplies or airborne toxins that could cause neurological symptoms. He contacted the Arkansas Department of Health and the Centers for Disease Control to request emergency assistance with identifying the cause of what appeared to be a widespread public health crisis. Meanwhile, his deputies were struggling to respond to an increasing number of emergency calls from people reporting violent encounters with affected individuals. Dr. Sarah Williams, the county's chief medical officer, arrived at the sheriff's department within an hour of being contacted about the crisis. Her preliminary assessment of the victims who had been brought to the county hospital revealed symptoms consistent with severe psychotic episodes, but with unusual characteristics that didn't match typical psychiatric conditions or known toxin exposures. The affected individuals showed signs of extreme agitation, dilated pupils, elevated heart rate, and hyperthermia, suggesting exposure to a stimulant substance, but blood tests failed to identify any common drugs or poisons. The geographic distribution of the affected individuals initially appeared random, with cases reported from all sections of the county without obvious connection to common water sources, food supplies, or environmental factors. However, when Thompson and Dr. Williams mapped the locations of the incidents, they discovered that all of the affected individuals lived within a 5-mile radius of the county's largest agricultural area, where several large farms used extensive irrigation systems and crop dusting operations that could potentially distribute airborne contaminants. The breakthrough in identifying the cause came when Dr. Williams received laboratory results showing that all of the affected individuals had elevated levels of synthetic compounds in their blood that were consistent with exposure to experimental psychoactive drugs. The substances appeared to be analogs of known hallucinogens that had been chemically modified to increase potency and duration of effects while avoiding detection by standard drug screening procedures. Further investigation revealed that the contamination was not accidental, but the result of a deliberate poisoning operation conducted by a clandestine drug manufacturing group that had been using the rural county as a testing ground for new synthetic compounds. The group had been introducing experimental drugs into the local water supply and agricultural systems to observe their effects on unsuspecting populations, treating the residents of Madison County as unwilling test subjects in what amounted to human experimentation. The drug manufacturing operation was discovered in an abandoned warehouse complex that had previously been used for agricultural equipment storage. The facility contained sophisticated laboratory equipment capable of producing large quantities of synthetic drugs, along with detailed records documenting the systematic poisoning of county residents over a period of several months. The operation was run by a group of rogue chemists who had been developing new psychoactive compounds for distribution in urban drug markets. The laboratory records revealed that the group had been gradually increasing the dosage and potency of the compounds being introduced into the county's environment, monitoring the effects through a network of informants who reported on unusual behavior among local residents. The sudden mass outbreak of psychotic episodes had occurred when the chemists had tested a new formulation that proved to be significantly more potent than their previous experiments. Thompson's investigation uncovered that several county residents had been recruited as unwitting informants for the drug operation, believing they were participating in a legitimate medical research study. These individuals had been providing regular reports on their neighbors' behavior and health, not realizing that they were helping monitor the effects of illegal human experimentation. Some informants had been compensated for their cooperation, while others had been coerced through threats or blackmail. The environmental contamination had been achieved through multiple methods, including direct introduction of chemicals into private wells, contamination of irrigation water used for crops, and aerial distribution through modified crop dusting equipment. The operation's scope was so extensive that determining the full extent of exposure would require testing every water source and food supply in the affected area. Emergency response to the crisis involved coordinating medical treatment for nearly 40 individuals who had been affected by the experimental drugs, while simultaneously conducting a criminal investigation to identify and arrest the members of the drug manufacturing group. Many of the affected individuals required hospitalization and intensive medical intervention to manage the severe psychological and physiological effects of the synthetic compounds. The psychological impact on the community extended far beyond those who had been directly poisoned. The knowledge that their environment had been deliberately contaminated and that their neighbors had been unknowingly recruited as informants created a climate of suspicion and fear that would persist long after the immediate crisis had been resolved. Many residents reported feeling paranoid about their water supplies, food sources, and even their relationships with longtime neighbors. The criminal investigation resulted in the arrest of 12 individuals involved in the drug manufacturing operation, including the chemists who had developed the experimental compounds and the distributors who had been responsible for environmental contamination. The prosecution faced unique challenges because the crimes involved experimental substances that were not specifically covered by existing drug laws, requiring creative legal approaches to ensure appropriate penalties. Federal agencies became involved in the investigation when it was discovered that the Arkansas operation was connected to similar drug manufacturing groups in other rural areas across the country. The use of isolated agricultural communities as testing grounds for experimental drugs appeared to be a systematic strategy employed by criminal organizations that understood that rural law enforcement agencies often lacked the resources to detect sophisticated chemical contamination. The cleanup of environmental contamination in Madison County required extensive testing and remediation efforts that continued for months after the initial outbreak. Water supplies had to be tested and treated. Agricultural products had to be destroyed, and soil samples had to be analyzed to determine the extent of chemical contamination. The economic impact on local farmers and businesses was substantial, as many had to destroy crops and livestock that might have been exposed to the experimental compounds. Long-term health monitoring was established for all county residents who might have been exposed to the experimental drugs, as the medical effects of the synthetic compounds were largely unknown. Some individuals who'd been directly affected by the high-dose exposure continued to experience psychological symptoms months after the initial incident, requiring ongoing psychiatric treatment and medication. For Sheriff Thompson, the mass poisoning case represented a fundamental shift in his understanding of rural crime and public safety. The realization that criminal organizations would deliberately contaminate an entire community for the purpose of illegal drug testing was both shocking and sobering. The case highlighted the vulnerability of rural areas to sophisticated criminal operations that could exploit the isolation and limited resources of small communities. The incident led to significant changes in how rural law enforcement agencies monitor potential environmental threats and coordinate with health authorities to detect unusual patterns of illness or behavior. New protocols were established for rapid response to suspected mass poisoning incidents, including procedures for environmental testing and medical evaluation of affected populations. Dr. Williams continued to monitor the long-term health effects of the experimental drug exposure, contributing to research that would help medical professionals understand and treat victims of similar incidents in other communities. The data collected from the Madison County incident became valuable for federal agencies working to prevent future cases of criminal human experimentation. The abandoned warehouse complex where the drug manufacturing operation had been conducted was permanently sealed and designated as a hazardous site, requiring ongoing environmental monitoring. The property serves as a reminder of how easily isolated rural areas can be exploited by criminal organizations that view small communities as convenient testing grounds for illegal activities. Thompson remains vigilant about potential environmental threats in his jurisdiction, working closely with health authorities and federal agencies to monitor for signs of unusual illness patterns or behavior that might indicate criminal contamination. The experience taught him that modern rural law enforcement must be prepared to deal with sophisticated threats that go far beyond traditional crime categories. The community of Madison County slowly recovered from the mass poisoning incident, but the experience left lasting changes in how residents view their environment and their neighbors. Water testing became routine for many families, and unusual behavior is now reported more quickly to authorities. The incident demonstrated that even the most isolated rural communities are not immune to the reach of criminal organizations willing to use innocent populations as subjects for illegal experimentation. Sheriff Janet Williams had been dealing with the usual challenges of rural law enforcement in Barron County, Kentucky, when the call came in on October 14th that would transform a routine investigation into a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of state and federal government. The initial report seemed straightforward enough. A single-vehicle accident on a remote stretch of County Road 421, where a luxury sedan had left the roadway and struck a tree, resulting in the death of the driver. What made the incident unusual was the identity of the victim, State Senator Robert Morrison, a prominent politician who had been traveling alone through a sparsely populated area far from his normal routes. Morrison had been scheduled to attend a campaign fundraiser in Lexington that evening, but his car was found nearly 60 miles from where he should have been, on a road that led to nothing more significant than a few scattered farms and abandoned coal mining operations. The senator's staff reported that he had left his office in Frankfort that afternoon for the drive to Lexington, but had apparently made an unexplained detour that brought him to one of the most isolated areas of Williams' jurisdiction. The accident scene appeared consistent with a driver who had lost control of his vehicle, possibly due to medical emergency or mechanical failure. Morrison's car had left the roadway at high speed, traveled nearly 50 feet through a wooded area, and struck a large oak tree with sufficient force to cause fatal injuries. there were no skid marks on the pavement to suggest the driver had attempted to brake, and no evidence of other vehicles being involved in the incident. Williams conducted the initial investigation according to standard procedures for fatal traffic accidents, documenting the scene, photographing evidence, and arranging for the vehicle to be towed to a secure impound lot for mechanical inspection. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment indicated that Morrison had died from injuries sustained in the crash, with no obvious signs of foul play or pre-existing medical conditions that might have caused him to lose control of the vehicle. The first indication that the case might involve more than a simple traffic accident came when Williams received a call from the Kentucky State Police requesting that all evidence be transferred to their custody, pending a federal investigation. Within hours of the accident, FBI agents had arrived in Barron County and were conducting their own examination of the crash site, using equipment and techniques that far exceeded what would normally be employed for a routine traffic fatality. Dr. Michael Chen, the county medical examiner, privately expressed concerns to Williams about pressure he was receiving from state officials to expedite his autopsy report and limit the scope of his examination. Chen had found anomalies in Morrison's blood chemistry that suggested possible poisoning, but was being instructed to focus only on injuries related to the crash itself. Most troubling was the discovery of a small puncture wound on Morrison's neck that appeared to have been made by a hypodermic needle, but this finding was not included in the official autopsy report. Williams began her own quiet investigation into Morrison's activities on the day of his death, trying to understand why he had been traveling through her county when he should have been en route to Lexington. Phone records showed that Morrison had received several calls during the afternoon from numbers that were registered to federal agencies, but the content of those conversations was classified and unavailable to local law enforcement. The senator's appointment calendar, obtained through Morrison's staff, showed that he had been scheduled for a meeting with federal investigators that afternoon regarding his involvement in a defense contract scandal that had been under investigation for several months. Morrison had been cooperating with the federal probe and had apparently agreed to provide testimony that would implicate other prominent political figures in a corruption scheme involving millions of dollars in fraudulent contracts. Morrison's personal assistant, Rebecca Stone, contacted Williams unofficially to report that the senator had been increasingly concerned about his safety in the weeks leading up to his death. Morrison had told Stone that he was receiving threatening phone calls and had noticed vehicles following him on multiple occasions. He had requested additional security from state police, but his requests had been denied on the grounds that there was no credible threat against him. The investigation became more complex when Williams discovered that Morrison's vehicle had been equipped with a sophisticated GPS tracking system that recorded not only his location but also his speed, direction, and driving patterns. The data from this system showed that Morrison had made several unexplained stops during his final journey, including a 20-minute period when his car was stationary at a location that had no obvious significance. Williams located the site where Morrison's car had stopped and found evidence of a second vehicle that had been parked there recently. Tire tracks and footprints indicated that Morrison had met with someone at this location shortly before his death. Most significantly, a search of the area revealed a disposable syringe that had been carelessly discarded in nearby brush, containing residue of a powerful paralytic agent that would have incapacitated Morrison within minutes of injection. The discovery of the syringe and the evidence of the meeting transformed the case from an accident investigation into a homicide inquiry, but Williams found herself increasingly isolated as federal agencies took control of the investigation and restricted her access to evidence. Her requests for information were denied, and she was instructed to cease all investigative activities related to Morrison's death. Williams' frustration with the federal takeover of the case led her to conduct her own parallel investigation, using resources and contacts that were outside official channels. she discovered that Morrison had been scheduled to testify before a federal grand jury the following week about defense contracts that had been awarded to companies with connections to prominent political figures, including a sitting U.S. senator and several high-ranking Pentagon officials. The defense contract scandal involved the fraudulent award of reconstruction contracts in Iraq and Afghanistan to companies that lacked the capability to perform the required work. Morrison had evidence that the contracts had been awarded based on political influence rather than competitive bidding, and that millions of dollars in taxpayer money had been diverted to personal accounts controlled by the conspirators. Morrison's cooperation with federal investigators had apparently made him a target for elimination by the same political network he was helping to expose. The sophisticated nature of his assassination, using a paralytic drug that would simulate a medical emergency while leaving no obvious trace in a standard autopsy, suggested involvement by professional operatives with access to military-grade chemical weapons and intelligence agency resources. Williams' investigation revealed that Morrison had been under surveillance for weeks before his death, with evidence of sophisticated electronic monitoring of his communications and movements. His phone records showed patterns of interference and dropped calls that were consistent with jamming equipment being used to disrupt his communications with federal investigators. Security cameras at various locations along his final route had mysteriously malfunctioned at crucial times, creating gaps in the timeline that concealed the movements of his assassins. The paralytic agent found in the discarded syringe was eventually identified as a synthetic compound that had been developed for military applications, but was not available through normal chemical suppliers. The substance could cause complete muscle paralysis within minutes while leaving the victim conscious and aware, creating the appearance of a medical emergency while ensuring that the victim could not call for help or control their vehicle. Williams discovered that similar substances had been used in at least 3 other suspicious deaths of political figures who had been cooperating with federal corruption investigations over the previous 2 years. In each case, the deaths had been attributed to medical emergencies or accidents, with local law enforcement agencies being excluded from the investigations and evidence being sealed under national security classifications. The cover-up of Morrison's assassination involved coordination between multiple federal agencies and state-level political figures who had been compromised by the same corruption network that Morrison had been preparing to expose. Williams found herself under increasing pressure to abandon her investigation, with threats to her career and personal safety becoming more explicit as she continued to pursue leads that federal agencies wanted buried. The breakthrough in understanding the full scope of the conspiracy came when Williams was contacted by a former CIA operative named David Parker, who had been monitoring the assassination from outside official channels. Parker revealed that Morrison's death was part of a systematic elimination campaign targeting witnesses in the defense contract corruption case, with at least 6 other potential witnesses having died under suspicious circumstances over the previous 18 months. Parker provided Williams with classified documents that showed how the corruption network had evolved into a criminal conspiracy that was willing to commit murder to protect billions of dollars in fraudulent contracts and prevent exposure of the political figures who had facilitated the scheme. The network included active and retired intelligence operatives who were using their specialized skills to eliminate threats to the conspiracy. The evidence that Parker shared with Williams revealed that the assassination team responsible for Morrison's death had been conducting surveillance operations throughout Kentucky, identifying potential locations for eliminating the senator in ways that would appear accidental. The remote stretch of road where Morrison died had been selected specifically because it provided isolation and limited law enforcement resources that could conduct a thorough investigation. Williams faced an impossible situation, possessing evidence of a political assassination and cover-up that reached the highest levels of government while being powerless to pursue justice through normal legal channels. Her attempts to interest federal prosecutors in the case were blocked by the same agencies that were participating in the cover-up, and her efforts to publicize the evidence were thwarted by classification restrictions and threats of prosecution under espionage laws. The conspiracy's reach extended to Williams's own department, where she discovered that her communications were being monitored and her investigative activities were being reported to federal agencies. Several of her deputies had been approached by federal agents and instructed to report on Williams' activities, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that made it impossible to conduct a normal investigation. Williams' determination to expose Morrison's assassination led her to take extraordinary risks, including secret meetings with journalists and congressional investigators who were willing to pursue the story despite the dangers involved. She provided copies of evidence to multiple sources, hoping that widespread distribution would make it impossible for the conspiracy to suppress the truth indefinitely. The public revelation of Morrison's assassination and the broader corruption scandal ultimately led to congressional hearings and a special prosecutor investigation that exposed the full extent of the criminal network. Dozens of political figures, defense contractors, and intelligence operatives were eventually prosecuted, though many of the highest-ranking conspirators escaped justice through plea agreements and immunity deals. For Williams, the Morrison case represented both a triumph and a cautionary tale about the limits of local law enforcement when confronting corruption that extends to the highest levels of government. Her persistence in pursuing the truth, despite overwhelming pressure and personal risk, ultimately helped expose one of the most significant political scandals in recent American history. The experience fundamentally changed Williams' view of law enforcement and government, revealing how easily democratic institutions could be corrupted when criminal networks gained sufficient influence over political and security agencies. She became an advocate for greater transparency and accountability in government, speaking at law enforcement conferences about the dangers of political corruption and the importance of maintaining investigative independence. Morrison's death became a symbol of the courage required to expose government corruption and the risks faced by those who choose to speak truth to power. The senator's willingness to cooperate with federal investigators despite threats to his safety inspired other witnesses to come forward, ultimately making possible the prosecution of the corruption network that had seemed untouchable. Williams continues to serve as sheriff of Barron County, but now maintains careful security protocols and varies her routines to minimize the risk of retaliation from criminal networks that might view her as a threat. The Morrison case taught her that rural law enforcement officers can find themselves at the center of national political scandals, and that maintaining integrity sometimes requires extraordinary courage and personal sacrifice. The remote stretch of County Road 421 where Morrison died has been designated as a memorial to victims of political violence, serving as a reminder that the price of democracy is eternal vigilance against those who would use murder to silence opposition and protect their criminal enterprises. The case continues to be studied by law enforcement agencies and political scientists as an example of how corruption can penetrate the highest levels of government, and the importance of local law enforcement independence in exposing such crimes. Sheriff Claude Boudreau had been working the same missing children case for 22 years, ever since he first pinned on a deputy's badge in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, where the cypress swamps and meandering bayous could swallow secrets whole and keep them hidden beneath dark waters that reflected Spanish moss and summer lightning. The case began in 1987 when 8-year-old Marie Thibodeau disappeared while walking home from school along the shell road that connected her family's fish camp to the main highway, but it would grow into something that consumed Boudreau's entire career and challenged everything he thought he knew about evil hiding in plain sight. Marie had been the daughter of Paul Thibodeau, a commercial fisherman who worked the Gulf waters and sold his catch to restaurants throughout southern Louisiana. The Thibodeau family had lived in the same fish camp for 3 generations, a collection of weathered buildings on stilts that stood above the floodline, where Bayou Teche wound through some of the most isolated territory in the parish. Marie was a quiet child who loved reading and helping her grandmother tend the small garden that provided vegetables for the family table. The day Marie disappeared had been typical for early October in Louisiana, hot and humid with afternoon thunderstorms that turned the unpaved roads into muddy channels that were barely passable in dry weather. Marie had walked the same route between school and home hundreds of times, a distance of roughly 2 miles along a shell road that passed only one other occupied dwelling, the home of the Boudreaux family who had been neighbors and friends of the Thibodeau clan for decades. When Marie failed to arrive home by her usual time, her father, Paul, began searching the road between school and the fish camp, expecting to find her taking shelter from the rain, or perhaps helping a neighbor with some small task that had delayed her journey. What he found instead was Marie's school backpack lying in a ditch beside the road, its contents scattered by the wind and rain that had been falling throughout the afternoon. The search for Marie involved virtually every able-bodied adult in the parish, with volunteers using boats to explore the countless waterways and hidden channels that crisscrossed the swamp landscape. Bloodhounds followed her scent from the location where her backpack was found, but the trail disappeared at a point where the shell road crossed a culvert that carried water between 2 sections of marsh. The heavy rains had washed away any tire tracks or footprints that might have provided clues about what had happened to the missing child. Boudreaux was a rookie deputy at the time, assigned to coordinate volunteers and maintain communication between search teams that were working in terrain so difficult that some areas could only be reached by shallow draft boats or on foot through knee-deep mud. The search continued for 2 weeks before being scaled back to periodic sweeps of areas that had been inaccessible during the initial effort, but Marie Thibodeau was never found. The case officially remained open, but with no physical evidence and no witnesses, the investigation gradually shifted to other priorities as new crimes demanded attention from the parish sheriff's department. Paul Thibodeau continued searching on his own for years, exploring every bayou and checking every abandoned camp that might conceal his daughter's remains. But eventually, even his efforts diminished as grief and age took their toll on his determination. Boudreaux never forgot Marie Thibodeau, partly because it was his first major case as a deputy, and partly because something about the circumstances of her disappearance had never felt right to him. The location where her backpack was found was only half a mile from the Boudreaux fish camp, and the timing of her disappearance coincided with a period when several strangers had been seen in the area, ostensibly conducting environmental surveys for the state government. The second disappearance occurred in 1993, when 10-year-old Tommy Boudreaux vanished while fishing from a pier behind his grandparents' house on Bayou Sorel. Tommy was Claude Boudreaux's own nephew, the son of his brother Robert, who operated a small marina and bait shop that served fishermen and hunters throughout the region. The boy had been an experienced swimmer and familiar with the dangers of bayou life, making it unlikely that he had simply fallen into the water and drowned. The search for Tommy followed the same pattern as the effort to find Marie 6 years earlier, with volunteers combing the waterways and adjacent swampland without discovering any trace of the missing child. But this time, Boudreaux was a more experienced investigator, and he noticed details that had escaped attention during the earlier case. Several witnesses reported seeing an unfamiliar boat in the area around the time of Tommy's disappearance, described as a white fiberglass hull with a large outboard motor and operated by someone who appeared to know the local waters well. The description of the suspicious boat matched similar reports from the time of Marie Thibodeau's disappearance, though the connection had not been recognized at the time because the investigations had been conducted by different personnel with limited communication between cases. Boudreaux began to suspect that the parish was dealing with a predator who was specifically targeting children in the most isolated areas where law enforcement response would be delayed and evidence would be difficult to preserve. Boudreaux's investigation revealed that both missing children had been taken from locations that were visible from the main waterway, but isolated enough that screams or calls for help would not be heard by potential rescuers. The predator appeared to have intimate knowledge of local geography and seasonal patterns of activity that would allow him to operate without being observed by fishermen, hunters, or other regular users of the swamp areas. The third disappearance occurred in 1998, when 9-year-old Sarah Guidry vanished while collecting dewberries along a trail near her family's camp on Bayou Courtableau. Sarah's disappearance followed the same pattern as the previous cases, with the child vanishing without trace from a location that was isolated but accessible by water. This time, however, search teams found evidence that had been missed in the earlier investigations. A careful examination of the area where Sarah was last seen revealed tire tracks from an all-terrain vehicle that had been driven to the edge of the bayou and backed toward the water as if to load something into a boat. The tracks were partially obscured by vegetation and would have been overlooked except for the systematic grid search that Boudreaux had insisted upon based on lessons learned from the previous cases. The tire tracks provided the first physical evidence that the children's disappearances were connected and had involved a vehicle that could access remote areas where normal cars and trucks could not travel. Boudreaux organized a survey of all ATV owners in the parish and neighboring areas, but the number of such vehicles was substantial, and many were owned by people who had legitimate reasons to access remote swamp locations. The breakthrough in the case came when Boudreaux received a call from a retired sheriff's deputy in neighboring Iberia Parish, who had been following newspaper coverage of Sarah Guidry's disappearance. The retired deputy, Herman Landry, reported that his parish had experienced similar child disappearances over the previous 15 years, with at least 5 children vanishing from remote locations under circumstances that matched the St. Landry Parish cases. The collaboration between parishes revealed a pattern of child disappearances that extended across much of southern Louisiana's swamp region, with cases dating back to the early 1980s. When the cases were mapped and analyzed together, they showed a clear geographic progression that suggested a single predator who had been operating throughout the region for nearly 2 decades. The geographic analysis revealed that the disappearances clustered around areas that were accessible by boat from major waterways, but isolated enough to provide privacy for criminal activity. Many of the locations were near hunting and fishing camps that were occupied only seasonally, creating opportunities for a predator to operate without being observed by potential witnesses. Boudreaux worked with state police investigators to develop a profile of the suspected predator, focusing on someone with extensive knowledge of South Louisiana waterways and access to both boats and all-terrain vehicles. The profile suggested someone who lived in the region year-round and whose occupation or lifestyle provided legitimate reasons to travel throughout the swamp areas without attracting suspicion. The investigation focused on guides, fishermen, hunters, and others whose work required them to travel extensively through remote swamp areas. One name that appeared repeatedly in witness statements and activity logs was Marcel Trosclair, a hunting and fishing guide who had been operating in the region for over 20 years, and whose services were used by clients from throughout Louisiana and neighboring states. Trosclair owned property on Bayou La Fourche that included a large workshop and boat storage facility that would have provided privacy for criminal activity. His work as a guide gave him intimate knowledge of remote areas and seasonal activity patterns that would allow him to avoid detection while transporting victims to hidden locations. Most significantly, he owned multiple boats and all-terrain vehicles that matched evidence found at several of the disappearance sites. Surveillance of Trosclair's property revealed that he maintained a sophisticated workshop that included metalworking equipment and large freezers that could have been used to preserve evidence or dispose of remains. His daily routine included regular trips throughout the swamp region, often to areas that were close to locations where children had disappeared. The evidence against Trosclair was entirely circumstantial until investigators obtained a search warrant for his property and discovered a hidden room beneath his workshop that contained personal items belonging to several of the missing children. The items had been carefully preserved and catalogued, suggesting that Trosclair had been keeping trophies from his victims over many years. The hidden room also contained photographs and videos that documented Trosclair's crimes against the missing children, providing definitive proof that he was responsible for their deaths. The evidence revealed that Trosclair had been using his position as a guide to identify potential victims and his knowledge of remote locations to carry out his crimes without detection. Trosclair was arrested at his property without incident, showing no surprise or resistance when confronted with evidence of his crimes. During interrogation, he confessed to killing 17 children over a period of 23 years, describing his actions with clinical detachment as if discussing routine business activities. The psychological evaluation of Trosclair revealed a sophisticated predator who had used his legitimate occupation as cover for systematic child murder spanning more than 2 decades. His knowledge of law enforcement procedures and investigative techniques had allowed him to avoid detection by carefully selecting victims and disposal sites that minimized the chances of discovery. The recovery of evidence from Trosclair's property led to the location of burial sites throughout the swamp region where he had disposed of his victims' remains. Many of the children were finally returned to their families for proper burial, providing closure that had been sought for decades by parents and relatives who had never stopped hoping for answers. For Boudreau, the resolution of the case represented both professional satisfaction and personal tragedy, as it confirmed that his nephew Tommy and the other missing children had been victims of a predator who had operated undetected for decades. The knowledge that the crimes could have been prevented if the pattern had been recognized earlier would haunt him for the rest of his career. The case led to significant improvements in coordination between law enforcement agencies in rural areas, with new protocols for sharing information about missing persons and suspicious activities that might indicate serial predator behavior. The isolated nature of swamp communities had enabled Trosclair to operate for years without detection, but enhanced communication systems made it more difficult for similar predators to avoid identification. Trosclair was convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death, though appeals are expected to continue for years. He showed no remorse during his trial and continued to describe his victims as objects rather than human beings, demonstrating the complete lack of empathy that had enabled him to commit such horrific crimes over such an extended period. The families of Trosclair's victims established a foundation dedicated to improving safety education for children in rural areas and supporting law enforcement efforts to investigate missing persons cases in remote locations. The foundation also works to maintain communication between families affected by similar crimes and to prevent the isolation that had enabled Trosclair to avoid detection for so long. Boudreau retired from law enforcement shortly after Trosclair's conviction, his career having been defined by the case that had begun with Marie Thibodeau's disappearance and ended with the capture of her killer. He continues to live in St. Landry Parish, where the cypress swamps and winding bayous serve as constant reminders of the secrets that can hide beneath their dark waters and the importance of never giving up the search for truth, no matter how long it takes to emerge.